Your stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Storymaker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons: to persuade, to entertain, and to connect. But what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, the next step is to develop how you share them. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you, and you'll nod your head in understanding. Then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those situations. During this podcast, I'm asking you to listen to consider your own related stories, and to consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Today's podcast features Julia Shamis. I am so pleased to have Julia Shamis here today on my podcast, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. And I'd love to introduce her as someone who really does a phenomenal job of helping people get career ready. One of her passions is to work with high school students and college students to help them be career ready, but mostly you're a recruiter, right, Julia?
Correct. Actually, my career has spanned both sides of the recruiting process. I started out majoring in human resources, and I was a corporate recruiter, actually an HR generalist, but gradually transitioned more to the recruiting side of things. And then I took that experience and switched over to the other side, helping job seekers with their job search efforts. So it's been great to apply those skills and that experience, really to see the process from both angles.
And I know that one of the reasons we connected was because of your interest and motivation to help people, particularly young adults, as they transition out of high school into college and out of college into the workforce. But that's not what this podcast is going to be about. And we can talk about that some other time. But for today, I always start my podcast with kind of an interesting introduction to my guest in order to really have our listeners feel like they get to know you beyond what you do. And it helps to set the stage for the rest of the conversation. So here's the question. Tell me something about yourself that people may not know, that they wouldn't find on your resume, your LinkedIn profile, or just in a basic introductory conversation with you.
Okay. So most people who know me know that I'm an introvert. I am generally pretty cautious by nature. And so it comes to many people as a really big surprise to find out that there's a little daredevil living inside of me. My husband and I were bitten by the travel bug about 20 years ago, and we've traveled pretty extensively around Europe. And in the course of those travels, we try to seek out activities that are really unique experiences. Not just seeing the sights, but really having an experience that we can remember for years to come, and that we can share with our grandkids years down the line. And so, as an example, one of those experiences, years ago, we were traveling to Rio and took the opportunity to go hang gliding. Hang gliding, literally jumped off a mountain 1,600 feet without a parachute. And it was, it's one of those things that you wouldn't imagine it, but it's very relaxing. It's very serene when you're actually in flight. When you're actually gliding. The scary part of it is, the part my heart is pounding as I'm talking about it, recalling it. The part that is truly terrifying is when you take off. And I remember the instructor, telling us step by step what we needed to do. And he said, just run as fast as you can. And when you get to the point where you no longer feel the ground under your feet, take 2 more steps. And that was kind of the part that I had a little trouble wrapping my mind around.
Right.
But, things like that, I am very open to trying just about anything once, within reason.
Wow. Okay, that does surprise me a little bit about you. I don't know you that well, but it
Wow, I would think landing would be more terrifying than taking off.
Landing just requires a little bit of technique, but it was a tandem flight. So actually, the
Oh,
instructor does most of the work as far as the landing is concerned. But that takeoff, oh my God! 20 years later, I still I still feel my heart pounding.
wow, that sounds amazing. And in Rio,
In Rio, yes. If you want a
wow.
bird's eye view, that's the way to go.
No kidding. That actually, that's funny because my family had a hot air balloon when I was a teenager. My dad, when we moved to Colorado Springs, my dad saw some balloons taking off and just got totally obsessed by it and ended up
Hmm.
going for his pilot's license. Then we
Oh
bought a
wow!
balloon. We had a commercial hot air ballooning business. And I remember it was the landings that scared me.
Right,
But I
right.
understand that sense of peacefulness that you get when you're up in the air
Hmm.
and you're not worried about anything because you're nowhere near anything.
Right. Right. Absolutely. I think it takes a little effort to kind of convince yourself to let your body relax. And I do recall being very, very tense for the first, I don't know, a couple of seconds, maybe a minute or so. But once I got to that point where, I just let go, just kind of release the tension. It was amazing. It was spectacular. Absolutely
Wow.
spectacular. Um, and actually, as we're talking, if you don't mind, I'll share one other crazy thing.
Of course.
I did.
Yes, please. I love
Uh,
this.
when my husband and I had our 10-year wedding anniversary, I generally try to find different experiences that we can share together. And I got this bright idea to get trapeze lessons. And so the two of us went off and learned how to fly on a trapeze.
Wow.
Which actually is as difficult as it looks because it requires very flexible back, which my husband does not have. I did gymnastics as a kid, so I was a little bit better prepared for that, but my husband not so much. And it was intended to be an anniversary gift, after which I was afraid he was going to divorce me.
He must have been sore for weeks
He
afterward.
was. He was. He was. Both physically
but
and
it
otherwise.
but it sounds so sexy, you know? But I guess if you're not flexible, it's not so sexy.
But looking back, though, I have to say, we've been together now for well over 20 years, and we look back on it, and these are stories that we can share with our kids, that really have become almost legend in our families, and I think it's those kinds of experiences really stand the test of time, and they strengthen your family relationships.
So that actually brings me right to the topic and theme of this conversation, which is morphing in my head as we speak, because we talked about um, travel and exposing our children and ourselves to different environments as our theme. But now, as we talk, I think that our theme is morphing into developing experiences in order to share these stories and share an experience with somebody that just uh, builds your relationship in a way other things can't.
Right.
So the reason this popped into my head is that my husband and I perform in a few bands together.
Mm-hmm.
And neither of us had ever really performed like that before. We had been married, gosh, 10 years when we started doing this, and neither of us had ever done this before. So I was almost 40, and my husband, who's a dozen years older than I am, was well over, or just over 50, or right around 50. As a matter of fact, I remember celebrating his 50th birthday, and it was at a gig where we were performing.
Mm-hmm.
And we had been performing together for a few years, and it's a trick. And as you said, with your trapeze experience, it's not always fun. It's not always good. And there have been times early in our musical career together that we were pretty close to giving it up. My husband is very particular, and there were times where he would say something about how I should try to sing something, And I'd look at him kind of incredulously, like, I'm a singer. I've been singing all my life, maybe not in bands, but in choirs. So don't tell me how to sing. And I
Right.
would get really defensive when he would criticize. And it was not just because I was being defensive, but because of how he would present it to me. And over the years, we've learned how to speak that language to each other without getting upset. But it took some time. And there were a couple times where I would say, okay, we're done. We're not doing this anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You're just not fun to be around when you're stressing out about doing a gig. But it was years into it when we had an opportunity to go to Germany together. He was working and I just joined him. And we ended up befriending a group in a bar called The Local Cure in Garmisch. And one of the owners, or a manager, I guess, was a musician, played the saxophone. And he was originally from Montana, which is ironic, I think, that we discovered this guy. And he and his wife were doing a band. They had just kind of started performing together. They had only been married a few years. And when we went to see them perform, he had mentioned that maybe I could get up and sing some harmonies with her. Well, she wanted nothing to do with that. And they ended up kind of having this marital tension that was visible by everybody. And it was a packed house.
Oh.
There were some storming off the stage moments, and where you could just see that tension. And I looked at my husband and I realized our marriage could not have withstood that test early on in our marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And those experiences together will either drive you together or drive you apart.
Right. Right.
Wow.
Right. That's that's a story.
That's a story. So launching into the next part, I'm going to keep using those flight metaphors just because we started with hang gliding and hot air ballooning. Launching into this theme, can you think of something that you've done with your husband or with your children that had that kind of impact, that either you realize that thank goodness we're still together, like the trapeze experience, or this definitely brought us closer together?
Nothing comes to mind in terms of that is such such a really significant experience. Although I'm sure, I know we've had them throughout our marriage, but it's just not coming to mind at the moment. But when it comes to travel, kind of taking a step back to the experience and how it develops people, both individually and as couples. We started traveling with our kids when they were very, very young, much too young, if you ask me. But it happened actually not because we were just seeking out adventure. It was actually something very different. My son, my eldest, when he was very little, had some health issues, and we really struggled to find help for him here in the States. Long story short, 4 years into it, he had surgery. He suffered from chronic rhinitis, so he was a mouth breather. He was never able to breathe through his nose properly, and so that kept the condition kept deteriorating until he ended up with sleep apnea when he was 4.
Oh.
So, following the advice of numerous doctors, we had his tonsils and his adenoids removed. And that, it was a blessing and a curse, because it solved one problem, but it created another. In that all the air that he was inhaling now wasn't being filtered because he didn't have the tonsils or the adenoids. And so he started picking up every bug that was going around. He started getting sick just constantly. And, antibiotics, and more antibiotics. Long story short, this went on for quite some time. And out of sheer frustration, my husband started researching alternative medical options, kind of holistic medicine, whatever else was out there. We were prepared to try anything. And we came upon a treatment center in Italy that makes use of hot springs, the water that comes from the hot springs there. And it's very, very high in sulfur content, which is great for all kinds of respiratory problems. So we decided to give it a shot, figuring that even if it doesn't help, it won't make it worse. It's all natural. And at the very
least, and you get a trip to Italy.
At the very least, we get a wonderful vacation out of it. Exactly. So that's kind of how it started. That's why it started. And we took our kids. To Europe when they were 7 and not yet 5, 7 and 4. And being there, the treatment only takes an hour a day, and the rest of the time we had to ourselves. So we really had an opportunity to travel, to sightsee, to make the most of that experience. And one of the things that we did, again, coming back to our sense of adventure, one of the things that we did was visit Pompeii and Mount Vesuvius.
Wow.
And here's my daughter, who is just shy of her 5th birthday. This little munchkin, she's very petite. And together as a family, we climbed Mount Vesuvius. Granted, she was on her father's back in a backpack most of the time,
right.
But she actually remembers it. She actually has a recollection of that experience. And I'm sure you'll recall, our kids are about the same age. I'm sure you'll recall when they went through the phase of the Magic Treehouse books. Right?
Yes. Those adventure books.
Absolutely. And my kids, I think they read the whole series at least half a dozen times. And so we took with us, my son was just at that age when he was getting into those books. We took with us Vacation Under the Volcano, which is all about Pompeii and Mount Vesuvius, and literally read it on the hike up with the kids. So that's I think one of the really tremendous advantages and the beautiful things about travel is that it brings history to life. To this day, my kids are much more engaged when they're studying history in school because it's real, it's meaningful. They have that connection. They have that connection, and they're enthralled. They're enthralled by it.
Mm-hmm.
It gets so far beyond names and dates, which unfortunately is how so many kids view history.
Right. Yeah, that's funny that you say that, because I remember when we were planning our first trip to Europe with the boys, and they were 8 and almost 11,
mm-hmm.
and we were planning this trip to Italy because my in-laws had rented an entire villa in the Asciano area, just outside of the little village of Asciano,
uh-huh.
and we had a whole week to stay there and took day trips. And then we were trying to figure out what we wanted to do before and after this week, and how to make the most of this, because we weren't going to go all the way to Italy for 1 week from Montana, because the
right.
tickets alone,
right,
coming from Montana, are ridiculous. So we went into a little bit of debt, but we were, for 1 whole week, we were put up. So we didn't have to worry about accommodations for that
mm-hmm.
week. And when I thought about what I wanted to do with the boys, one of the things, even though Rome wasn't really on my list, the Colosseum wasn't something that I was really compelled to go see, what I really, the reason we ended up going to Rome was because I wanted the boys to see things from history that they would recognize anywhere they were, in a book, in a movie. They had some context for those particular landmarks.
Right.
And so I wanted to make sure we saw the Colosseum so that when they saw it on Scooby-Doo, they would say, oh my gosh, we've been there. To be able to have context for those landmarks.
Absolutely.
So I hadn't thought of it in terms of their interest in history, but they are definitely more interested in history than I think they would have been otherwise.
Yes.
And when we were planning that trip, we were talking about going to see the Colosseum and reminding them of where they had seen it, like on Scooby-Doo, there was an episode. And we were talking about how people would be eating like a turkey leg while watching gladiators be pulled apart at the joints,
right.
Losing limbs, and they'd be eating and enjoying it like entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
And we had just talked to the boys about not playing violent video games. And I remember Jacob, who was almost 11, he said, talk about being desensitized. So there was all that context now. Anyway, but coming back to travel, what I find is really important is that it doesn't matter where you go necessarily, that you don't have to go to Europe with your kids to expose them to different environments. And I think some people make the mistake of thinking that in order to expose their kids to different things, they have to make it a big deal.
No.
But we used to go on these ridiculous road trips because we didn't have money. I mean, things were so tight. And so sometimes we would my mom gave us a membership to the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman, which is about an hour-and-a-half drive from Helena. And she gave us an annual membership. So we would just go to Bozeman and go to the museum and see the dinosaurs and whatever exhibits were new. And just leaving town and going in the car for an hour and a half was part of the adventure.
Right. Right. I think that's such a great point. And I debate this with my husband all the time, because we're kind of on different ends of the spectrum here. For him, a vacation has to be, you have to get on a plane. You have to go through the pain of packing, planning, reserving, traveling, getting caught in flight delays and whatever else. It's not a vacation unless he experiences that for some strange reason. And I explain to him all the time that a staycation for me would actually be a dream come true, because there is so much available. Living just a stone's throw from New York City, my God, there are so many, educational, cultural, entertaining things available to do. There's actually more that we've seen in Europe, truthfully, than we have in the States, which I think is such a shame. And we have to make a more concerted effort to take advantage of what is literally, literally in front of us here.
I totally agree. And I think the reason we discovered this, I mean, there were a couple of reasons. One was we live in Montana, which you don't have to go far to be in the middle of nowhere. I mean, seriously, you could drive 5 hours and not see another vehicle in some parts of our state. And there are parts of our state, even within an hour of the capital city, that there's no connection, that you have no signal on your phone. And so part of it is there's so much to see here that's close by that we've discovered the joys of just driving 2 hours and going for a hike up into the wilderness and going fishing, going kayaking. And we can do that in one day. We don't have to take a vacation to float the Missouri River for 3 or 4 hours. And it doesn't take a whole lot of preparation. We throw the kayaks on top of the truck and stop at Safeway for picnic snacks and, have the cooler with ice and beer and water and grab the dog, and we're gone for the day.
Yes. I'm sorry. I was going to say, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's beauty in being disconnected for some period of time.
Because, yes, of course.
In our society, we're just everyone, adults, kids, and everyone in between is just constantly connected, linked, and nothing in the grand scheme of things. If we take a step back and really look at, what is critical, what's truly time sensitive, what's crucial, we can probably shut off our devices very easily for a day and connect with the people around us, with the family members, with the friends, those people whose input and involvement in our lives really, really matters the most.
Exactly. And especially with our children and our spouse, I find that those adventures where you can put the device down or disconnect in some way just will bring you closer to those partners in your life. And time is so short. How fast they grow up. And I know that our children have very vivid memories of being on the river with us and going camping. And that's cheap. That's cheap entertainment.
Right.
And I love to tell people that our kids are just as comfortable wandering through the streets of Paris as they are camping in the wilderness of Montana.
Right. Or probably in your backyard, for that matter.
In our backyard. Well, yeah. Well, there's no camping allowed. And no, I'm just kidding. So I know that you have a story of travel with your kids that you want to share. that really is kind of the ideal of what you learn when you're traveling with your children and what you're exposing them to?
Well, one truly phenomenal experience that we had is our most recent. As you know, we just came back from vacation, and once again it was to Italy. We've actually been to Italy more times than I can count, mainly because we've been taking our son for treatments. It's been like this annual pilgrimage that we make there. But this year we decided to bypass the treatments, and we went to Sicily, which is a place we haven't actually made it to before. And the most spectacular experience of my life, truly no exaggeration, took place on this trip. So we visited 3 different volcanoes this time. One of them was Mount Etna, which is as you know, the tallest volcano in Europe, 12,000 feet, or is it 11? I think it's 11, and they allow people to go up to 10. So that's where we were. The second one was Stromboli, and then there was a smaller one, 800 meters, that you're able to walk all the way up to the crater. We made a very ambitious effort, all 4 of us, and then my daughter and I, after like 3/4 of the way up, it was just much too hot. It was brutally hot. We called it a day, and and let the guys do the last bit on their own. They did go up to the crater, took some spectacular pictures, which they brought back to us. But the most memorable experience of this trip was a night tour that we took around the island of Stromboli, which is an active volcano, which is erupting all the time. Not this grand, Mount Vesuvius, experience that everybody, thinks of back in the day. But there's always something, there are some small kind of, mild explosions happening all the time, day and night. And so we reserved a boat tour that started while it was still light outside at 5 o'clock. Got to enjoy the sights, beautiful, beautiful scenery around. And then they dropped us off actually on the island. We went up there to have dinner. There's actually a small town there. People actually live there.
Wow.
It's an active volcano, and there are just houses perched, kind of hanging off the cliff. It's quite unbelievable, quite surreal. But having spent 3 hours there, we had dinner. By the time we came out, it was pitch black, and it was a very, very fortunate coincidence that this happened to be the day of the lunar eclipse, which wasn't visible here, but there, by the time we came out, the sky was just spectacular. The moon was dimmed by the eclipse. Mars was shining really brightly. You could see a million stars, and the volcano in the distance was spewing out red lava above us. And so watching this from the water, dead silence. You couldn't hear you could hear a pin drop. There are no words. I'm really struggling to find the words, but it was the most unbelievable thing I have ever witnessed in my life. Those types of memories will last for the rest of our lives. I'm sure that is an experience that my kids will hold on to for as long as they live. It really puts things in perspective. Watching something like that, makes you realize how small, how insignificant you are, in the grand scheme of things when you're watching nature do its thing. It's amazing. It's very, very humbling. Very humbling.
Magical is
Thank
the
you.
word that pops
That's
in
the right
my head.
word. Yes, that's the right word.
Magical.
Yes. Thank you for that.
And you got to experience that with your husband and your children, which comes back to our theme about how those stories bring us together and help us to tell our shared stories later on. I think one of the things that we forget as adults is that when our children grow, they're going to have these stories, and they're going to sound a little different from how we tell them. And
Right.
building them together, I think, is really important. When we got back, we took our boys to Paris for a week and London for a week a few years ago. And we got back, and it was probably about 6 months after that, because we went in November, low season, flights were much cheaper. We're really being frugal about our trip. And we found an apartment in Paris so that we wouldn't have to pay for a hotel room. And so we could have meals in the apartment, which is one of the primary expenses, is meals.
Huge, yes.
So we did this all on a pretty tight budget as far as, going to Paris is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember about 6 months after, so it was probably May, I asked our younger son, who must have been 13 or 14 when we went on this trip. So he was maybe almost 15 when I asked him this question. I said, tell me something you remember from when we were in Paris. And he mentioned the catacombs, because my husband didn't really want to go. He wasn't interested in going. So the boys and I took a tour at night of the catacombs.
Oh, okay.
And we took the train from the apartment down to the stop where we could find the entrance to the catacombs. And he remembered that. And he remembered a couple that we met when we were wandering through those catacombs, where we took turns taking pictures of each other so we wouldn't have to do selfies. And but he didn't really remember much of the story of being there. Mm-hmm. So I reminded him of some of the things that we did and funny things. And in particular, when we got lost, and it was not a pleasant part of our trip, but it was a very memorable part of our trip when we were looking for this fancy, humongous flea market on the other side, on the north side of Sacré-Cœur. And we decided that we could just walk there. And we must have walked 5 miles that day looking, and we couldn't find it. We never did end up finding it, but we found a train station. We got back to the Marais district where we were staying. But I reminded him of that story, and we talked about what we could have done differently. I said, the thing about travel is that sometimes I'm not as good a problem solver when I'm in a different environment. Right. And I'm not thinking like a problem-solving person, which I am a problem solver. That's my nature. Mm-hmm. If I had been thinking at the time, I could have just said, we're going to call a cab and they'll know where the market is. Right. We could have easily done that. And I don't know why my problem-solving brain wasn't working like that at the time.
But what's really funny is that you could have done that if you were comfortable enough with the language. And that's actually, I have a great story with regard to that. Many years ago, this was actually before we had kids, my husband and I took a trip with friends to Spain. And this was hysterical. So many years have passed, and it just as you mentioned, it's one of those experiences that just is so memorable that we recount it, we retell it, and it's just it lives on. So we ended up at a restaurant for dinner, and the friends that we were traveling with actually keep kosher, so they're on a restricted diet. And my friend had to literally ask, about each dish. Okay, what are the ingredients? What does this contain? To make sure that she wasn't consuming anything she wasn't supposed to. And this is Spain. I mean, good luck finding a meal without pork, right?
Right.
So we're in a restaurant, and we each, speak a few words of Spanish, but that's about the extent of it. And so it just the process of translating the menu, would take us close to an hour. And finally, my friend settles on a salad, and she just asked the waiter to tell her exactly what was in that salad, to be certain. And so he starts translating literally, vegetable by vegetable, everything that is in the salad, and it's all good to go until we get to the last word, cebolla. And we don't know what it is in Spanish, and he has no idea how to translate it into English. So he's trying. He was really so helpful. He was trying really, really hard, but just it wasn't registering. We just weren't getting it. We couldn't figure out what this word was. And this poor man, finally everyone in the restaurant is staring at him, and he's playing this game of charades, and it's just we're not connecting the dots. It's not happening. So finally he takes off his glasses and he starts sniffling. And then he starts furiously rubbing at his eyes. and the light bulb goes off. It's an onion. You know, and it was just such a memorable experience that I still see this waiter. I can still picture him crying in front of us. But you know, the real takeaway from that experience is that, you know, once again, I find that so much of what we go through when we travel is really humbling. You don't really appreciate living at home, being in an environment where you can communicate, you can express yourself, you can ask for help when you need to. When you're dropped into a foreign country where you barely speak the language, you don't know anyone, and you struggle to understand, to make yourself understood, and you're truly relying on the kindness of strangers to do the most basic things, like order your dinner or clarify directions, make sure that you're not headed into some shady part of town where you shouldn't be taking a 5-mile hike through.
Right.
It's really, really humbling to find yourself in that kind of situation. And I think from the perspective of what it teaches, what it's taught both us and our kids, it's a great lesson in compassion and in humility.
Completely agree. And the same can be said for experiencing wilderness. It's so humbling. And at least with me and our family, we come away from those experiences full of gratitude for running hot water, being able to turn on the tap and take a shower in warm water after we've been camping for 3 days.
Right.
And so the gratitude, definitely, that piece is in there. But humbling is right. And I think when we expose our children to those environments, we're offering them just incredible stories to share later on, that when they tell them, they remember how they felt at the time.
Right.
Which, again, coming back to being humbling. Wow. So I'm imagining this waiter crying, and your friends thought that it was as funny and memorable as you did, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're very close friends. Our kids are actually best friends. They're practically the same age, and so we relive this.
All the time.
Experience all the time. We do.
It connects you. And what's funny is, it's not just at the time that you feel connected. It's years later. Every time you think of that story, you think of them and your relationship with them.
Definitely. This is such a great conversation because stories are coming to mind that I hadn't planned to talk about, but my memory is being jogged. The one other thing that I wanted to mention, which I think is so critical from the perspective of my job, what I do for a living in terms of helping people with their career progression, with their job search, is the fact that I think it's tremendously important, especially when you're young, to be open to anything and everything, to just exploring things that perhaps you don't think you have an interest in, perhaps you never even considered, never imagined. But I'll give you an example. My son is 17. He's about to start his senior year of high school. And what he's considering, what he's actually planning to go into right now is engineering. And how he came to that, I trace it directly back to a trip that we took to Spain, to Barcelona, specifically with the kids, because that's where he was exposed for the first time to modernist architecture. And it stirred something in him. It stirred something in all of us. But my husband and I had been there before, had seen it before. I think Barcelona is just one of the most beautiful, spectacular places we've ever visited. But seeing it for the first time, being exposed to, the masterpieces by Gaudí, Sagrada Familia, the Casa Batlló, which is that amazing building that looks like a dragon. It's the story of St. George and the Dragon. And there are so many other marvels throughout the city that it something happened to him during that trip. And he came home and said, Mom, during the summer, I want to go to, I want to go to some kind of specialized camp, either engineering or architecture. And we actually did find him two opportunities. That it was the summer between his freshman and sophomore year of high school, and he did attend two camps, and he discovered a passion for it.
Wow.
And granted, he's evolved over the years. Right now, kind of in the last 2 years, he's gotten much more involved in technology, and now he's thinking about computer engineering. But I think it was that exposure, it was that experience that opened his eyes to something he otherwise was not even considering. It wasn't on his radar at all.
So being open to things with that sense of humility, knowing that you're going to learn things and that you don't know everything, I think is one of the key points of that whole conversation. Is because I know as a young adult, I often walked into things just assuming that I knew things.
Right. Well,
and not with the humility that would have been helpful at the time.
The nature of every teenager, isn't it?
Yes. Oh, yes. I know everything. You can't teach me anything. Oh my gosh. Yes. And that kind of brings me back to this whole idea of when you're traveling, the humility involved. One of the things that I always remember from our trips is when things go wrong. Mm-hmm. And early on in my relationship with my husband, before we were engaged, when we were first starting to date, we were living in Washington, D.C., and he wanted to take me camping. And I was not a camper. I was not an outdoorsy person. I was born in Washington, D.C., raised in a Jewish household. We didn't camp. I mean, we hiked day hikes that were well-worn, no wilderness in my childhood. But we had outdoor experiences, but it wasn't rugged outdoor experiences. So my husband said he was going to take me camping. And the morning we woke up, I mean, there were all kinds of things that did not go according to plan. But the biggest was in the morning, I woke up in the tent hearing the drip, drip, drip on the top of the tent.
Oh, no.
And I look outside and we're under a canopy of trees, but I can see around us that it's, sprinkling. There's some sprinkling going on. Bob had already made coffee with a little stovetop espresso thing on the gas with the burner on top. Mm-hmm. And then he had a little pan out there that he was going to make pancakes. And he handed me my coffee, and I put on some shoes and a sweatshirt, and I climbed out of the tent, and we said good morning and did our whole, kissing morning routine that you do when you're first dating. Well, actually, we still do that, but 20 something years later, but
wow, that's impressive.
Yeah. But I remember looking down into this pan that he's making pancakes in, and then looking up at him and saying, I've never had poached pancakes before. Maybe we should wrap this up. And the pan is starting to fill with water, and the rain is starting to come down. It's getting muddy. We have his lab out there, his yellow lab, who is playing in the mud and getting filthy. And all of a sudden we're like, oh my gosh, we have to pack everything in and get out of this rain. Right. So we pack up the tent, and we're like throwing everything into the trunk of this Honda. And we put the dog in the car. And by the time we both get in the car, we're mud up, past our ankles. And we look like drowned rats. Our hair is all wet. We're just, we're soaked. Mm-hmm. And he's grumpy because it didn't turn out the way that he had intended. He wanted this to be some very civilized experience for my first real camping experience. Although car camping, now living in Montana for nearly 20 years, is like, well, that's not really camping. But at the time, it seemed like camping. And I remember getting into the car, and he's grumpy. And we stopped at a stop sign, and I said, you have a choice, right? He said, what do you mean? And I said, you can see this as part of the adventure and make it fun and laugh about it, or you can be grumpy because it's. And then I stopped speaking, which is unusual for me. I have a tendency to get deeper and deeper, digging myself into a hole that I can't get out of. But at that point, I don't know, maybe because I was tired, I just stopped. And it was, I gave him time to grieve that loss of his plan.
Right.
And then a few minutes later, he said, there's a diner on the other side of this little town that we're going to drive through. Do you want to go, or are you feeling too uncomfortable? And I said, no, I think we should go. Let's go get some breakfast. And I'm hungry. I'm always hungry. And we started to drive, and he looked at me, I looked at him, and we both burst out laughing. And he said, I don't know if they're going to let us in because we were so wet and so muddy. And I said, well, we can wipe off the mud. We have a towel. We'll wipe off the mud off our feet so that we don't make a mess when we walk in the door. And of course, they let us in. It was an old diner in West Virginia. We were probably clean compared to some of the other people in there. So it was, but I think remembering that helps us when things are not going right to think about the fact that we have that choice, especially when we're traveling and we have flight delays or flight cancellations, and it's going to change everything. Remembering that this is part of the adventure, it's part of learning and growing by experiencing this, and that we don't really have a lot of control over those things. So getting frustrated with it makes the story not any fun to remember.
Absolutely. Oh, Sarah, that is such an important point, and I'm so glad that you brought it up, because through all of our travels, through all of our experiences, doesn't matter where we're going, doesn't matter what we're doing, there will always be something that goes wrong. There's always some element of the unexpected, and what's interesting in our family is that by nature, I am a planner. I'm a scheduler. I have a spreadsheet for absolutely everything going on in my life. My husband, in the course of the everyday, not so much. He relies on me for that. But when it comes to vacation planning, it's actually one of his passions. He loves doing the research. He loves, he just loves getting into all the nitty-gritty details, which is fine with me, perfectly fine with me. Just tell me how long we're going for and what the weather's like, what I need to pack, and I'm good.
Right.
But, I think because he puts so much of himself, he puts so much effort, time, and energy into the planning process, he almost takes it personally when something goes wrong. And it's critical, to your point. It's so important to, kind of leave some time, flexibility, and also kind of leave your mind open to adjusting. Things will happen. You don't know what will happen, but something will invariably happen, will go wrong. And I love your point that it is part of the experience. It's part of the adventure. It's part of the memory. And, sometimes it may be something very uncomfortable, very unpleasant, very, very wet. You're unhappy. You're really unhappy to be in that moment when you're in it. But in hindsight, it becomes a great memory, and it becomes something that you really, really treasure. And there's one example really quickly that I can talk about. My husband and I actually honeymooned in France and did quite a bit of traveling throughout the country. And at one point, we had a rental car and got a flat tire, like literally just in the middle of nowhere. The houses were really spread out, and my husband's great in that he makes a point of trying to learn at least a little bit of the language no matter where we go. So he actually speaks a little bit of French, a little bit of Spanish, a little bit of Italian, a little bit of Greek, this and that, enough to make himself understood, enough to make the effort. But what I recall from this experience is that here we are in the middle of nowhere, and we were really young. We were, really inexperienced. What do you do? What do you do? I don't recall exactly how we ended up at someone's house. Probably walked there. But we ended up knocking on someone's door, and I will never forget how incredibly helpful and inviting these people were. They actually brought us into their house, sat us down, poured us drinks, and after we were sufficiently relaxed, the husband went out with my husband and practically changed the tire for him.
Wow.
Here we are, complete strangers. We could barely string 2 words of French together, and it's one of the most pleasant memories of my honeymoon.
Oh, I love that. That's so romantic and sweet.
We've had
And
others though. They weren't all quite so romantic. We did get burgled in France too.
Oh no. Well, and back to your trapeze story. I mean, again, these are things that there were times when I've traveled with my husband where I don't want to be anywhere near him because he's so grumpy, because things did not go the way he wanted.
Right.
But it's interesting because if we go into it knowing this about our partner, that this is their response sometimes, then it really helps that later on you can look back and say, do you remember when you were like this before?
Mm-hmm.
How about we do this differently this time?
Right.
You can say it in a playful way and remind them of that story. Remember how that worked out. This is going to work out too. We just
Definitely
can't take ourselves too seriously.
Absolutely. Life is a learning process, and we evolve with it and through our experiences. So definitely, recalling who we were in our travels 20 years ago and who we are now, it's like looking at different people, and it's great to see. It's great to see. It's everything you experience in life you learn from, right?
This has been such a great conversation. I mean, we both obviously are passionate about travel and experiences, and clearly we both prioritize our finances to provide those things for our children and ourselves. I definitely, especially living in Montana, I feel compelled to travel because Montana is so insulated and isolated. And I'm grateful for this conversation. It feels like I found a sister with a similar attitude about travel, but completely different in planning processes.
Thank you so much. I have absolutely loved this conversation, and who knows, maybe I can talk you into hand gliding next time.
It wouldn't take a lot of talking me into, because it doesn't take a lot to talk me into things like that. So yes, when we meet, we'll have to do something really interesting and adventurous, and we'll have to record it so that we can share it with the listeners later on and say, see, we followed up.
There you go. It's a plan. Thank you so much, Sarah. This has really been delightful.
Thank you. And we will talk soon. Oh, for our listeners, I will have a blog post associated with this podcast. It'll be on my website, elkinsconsulting.com, with some images and some links to what Julia does and what her interests are. And you can learn a little bit more about Julia and maybe connect with her on LinkedIn. Thanks again, Julia.
Thank you, Sarah. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?